In the ruthless calculus of the 20th and 21st centuries, the world was largely defined by a chessboard divided by a single brutal line. On one side stood the American eagle, the superpower of the West, projecting capitalism, democracy, and overwhelming military firepower across the oceans. On the other side lay the Chinese dragon, first a revolutionary communist threat, and later an awakening economic titan, hungry to reclaim its place as the center of the world. For decades, the unwritten rule of geopolitics was simple. You must choose a side. If you were a small nation, a nation without nuclear weapons or massive armies, you had two options. You could bow to Washington and become a client state of the West, or you could kneel to Beijing and become a satellite of the East. To be small was to be a vassal, and to refuse to choose was usually a death sentence, a guarantee that you would be crushed by the gravitational pull of these colliding giants. But in the heart of Southeast Asia, on a tiny, resource-poor island that barely appears on a standard map, one man decided to reject the laws of physics. Kuan looked at the eagle and the dragon, and where other leaders saw an existential threat, he saw an unparalleled opportunity. He realized that a small state, if led with supreme intelligence and absolute ruthlessness, did not have to be a victim of the great powers. It could be a broker between them. He decided that Singapore would not choose a side. Instead, it would make itself so indispensable to both sides that neither could afford to let it fall. This was an act of supreme geopolitical audacity, a gamble that required walking a razor's edge over a pit of fire every single day for 50 years. The conventional wisdom regarding Kuan is often simplistic, painting him as a Western ally because he spoke English and welcomed American banks, or alternatively as a Chinese sympathizer because of his ethnicity and his admiration for order. Both views are wrong. Kuan was not pro-American, and he was certainly not pro-Chinese. He was, unapologetically and ferociously, pro-Singapore. He viewed the superpowers not as friends, but as utilities, massive sources of energy that could be tapped to power his own nation's rise if handled with the correct protective gear. He understood the psychology of nations better than perhaps any other leader of his time. He looked at the United States and saw a superpower driven by a fear of communism and a desire for stability in the Pacific, so he sold them exactly what they wanted: a reliable anti-communist fortress and a logistical hub for their military and their corporations. He traded Singapore's loyalty for American protection and American dollars, using their paranoia to fund his nation's development. Simultaneously, he looked at China and saw a wounded civilization with limitless potential, trapped by ideology, but desperate to regain its strength. He positioned himself not as a student of China, but as a mentor, the only man in the world who could explain the West to the Chinese and explain China to the West. He offered Beijing the blueprint for modernization, proving to them that a society could be authoritarian, Asian, and rich all at the same time. By making Singapore the gateway for Western capital into China, he ensured that Beijing viewed his island not as a traitorous outpost of the West, but as a vital artery for their own survival. He played a double game of such complexity that it baffled observers. He would lecture American presidents in the Oval Office on why they were wrong about Asia, and then fly to Beijing to lecture the Communist Party on why they were wrong about the global economy. How did he get away with it? How did a man leading a country with the population of a minor American city manage to sit at the high table of global diplomacy and dictate terms to the masters of the universe? The answer lies in his mastery of realpolitik, the understanding that power respects only power, even if that power comes from intellect rather than muscle. He made Singapore the interpreter of the East, the necessary filter through which the superpowers spoke to each other. This introduction sets the stage for one of the greatest high-wire acts in history, revealing how Kuan transformed Singapore from a potential battleground into a neutral vault, a place where the eagle and the dragon could meet, trade, and learn, all while the mouse that tamed them grew rich on the commission. This is the story of how Kuan avoided being crushed by the elephants, by convincing them that they needed him to navigate the jungle. To understand the masterstroke of Kuan foreign policy in the 1960s, one must first appreciate the deep irony of his political origins. In his youth, Lee was not the darling of American capitalism. He was a firebrand anti-colonialist who rose to power on the backs of labor unions and had formed temporary alliances with the very communists he would later hunt down. But Lee Kuan Yew possessed a quality that few revolutionaries have, the ability to abandon ideology the moment it stopped being useful. As he took the reins of a newly independent Singapore, he looked at the Soviet Union and China, and he saw poverty, stagnation, and rigid dogmatism. Then he looked at the West, specifically at the United States and Japan, and he saw capital, technology, and markets. He realized a fundamental truth that would define the rest of his life. The East might have the soul, but the West had the money. If Singapore was to survive, it could not afford the luxury of socialist solidarity. It needed to plug itself directly into the American economic engine. However, this was easier said than done. In the 1960s, the United States was paranoid. Washington viewed Southeast Asia through the terrifying lens of the domino theory, convinced that if Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of the region, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, would fall in quick succession. To the CIA and the State Department, Singapore was a suspicious place, a Chinese-majority island in a Malay sea, teeming with left-wing student movements and labor strikes. They feared Singapore would become a third China, a beachhead for Beijing to export revolution into the region. Lee Kuan Yew knew he had to flip this narrative. He had to convince the Americans that Singapore was not a threat, but rather their most reliable, unsinkable aircraft carrier in Southeast Asia. He had to market his country as the ultimate bastion of anti-communism, a fortress of stability in a sea of chaos. This led to Lee's most controversial and Machiavellian geopolitical gamble, his full-throated public support for the Vietnam War. At the time, the war was deeply unpopular globally. In Europe, students were rioting in the streets against American imperialism. In Asia, many leaders were condemning the U.S. bombing campaigns, but Lee Kuan Yew went to the United States in 1967 and did the unexpected. He stood before American audiences and told them that they were doing the right thing. He argued that the United States' presence in Vietnam was vital for the security of the free world. This was shocking to the American liberal elite and infuriating to the communist bloc, but Lee was playing a deeper game. He didn't love the war, and he certainly didn't want Singaporean soldiers dying in the jungles of the Mekong Delta. But he understood the value of time. He argued that the United States was buying time for the rest of Southeast Asia. Every day the Americans held the line in Vietnam, fighting the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, was one more day that communism was contained. It was one more day for Singapore to build its factories, strengthen its army, and stabilize its economy. Lee calculated that if the Americans left too early, the wave of communism would sweep over the region before Singapore was strong enough to resist it. He essentially viewed the American military machine as a massive, expensive shield that was protecting his island for free. He wanted the Americans bogged down in Vietnam for as long as possible, acting as a buffer while he engaged in nation-building behind the lines. But Lee Kuan Yew was not content with just protection. He wanted profit. He turned Singapore into the logistical backbone of the American war effort. He opened Singapore's ports to the U.S. Navy, allowing their warships to dock, refuel, and repair. This turned the island into the gas station of the Pacific Fleet. The massive oil refineries that Singapore built were running at full capacity, turning crude oil into the jet fuel and diesel that powered American bombers and tanks in Vietnam. By some estimates, during the peak of the war, American military spending accounted for nearly 15% of Singapore's national income. The war that was tearing Vietnam apart was simultaneously building Singapore up. Furthermore, he tapped into the rest and recreation market. Thousands of American GIs, exhausted from the horrors of the jungle, were given leave time. Lee Kuan Yew made sure Singapore was their destination of choice. It was clean, it was safe, it spoke English, and it welcomed their dollars. Hotels filled up, restaurants boomed, and the service industry exploded. The influx of American cash during the late 60s and early 70s provided the critical capital injection that Singapore needed to industrialize. While other nations were protesting the morality of the war, Lee Kuan Yew was cashing the checks, using the revenue to build public housing, schools, and infrastructure. This strategy cemented a bond of trust with Washington that went beyond diplomacy. The Americans realized that while Lee Kuan Yew was prickly, arrogant, and refused to be a puppet, as evidenced by the CIA bribery scandal, he was fundamentally on their side when it mattered. He was a realist they could do business with. By the time the United States finally withdrew from Vietnam in 1975, the domino of Singapore did not fall. Instead, it had hardened into a diamond. Li had successfully used the American shield to buy 10 years of peace and prosperity, transforming his country from a vulnerable outpost into an economic powerhouse that no longer needed the war to survive. He had bet on the American horse not out of love, but because he knew it was the only horse that could pull his cart out of the mud. But as the 1970s ended and a new giant began to stir in the north, Kuan knew that the game was about to change again. The American shield had served its purpose, but to secure the future, he would now have to learn how to dance with the dragon. The year was 1978, a pivotal moment that would alter the trajectory of human history, though few realized it at the time. While Singapore was busy counting the profits from its American alliance, China was just waking up from a decades-long nightmare. The Cultural Revolution had left the Middle Kingdom shattered, impoverished and intellectually stagnant, trapped in a rigid ideological straitjacket where fervent communism mattered more than feeding the people. To the leaders in Beijing, Singapore was not a friend. It was a kinsman traitor, a city of ethnic Chinese who had sold their souls to Western capitalists and allowed American warships to dock in their harbor. The propaganda machine in China painted Singapore as a decadent, exploitative colony of the imperialists, a place to be pitied and eventually liberated. But in November of 1978, the new paramount leader of China, Deng Xiaoping, decided to see this traitorous island for himself. He was traveling to Southeast Asia to shore up support against Vietnam and the Soviet Union, but what he found in Singapore would shake his worldview to its very core. When Deng Xiaoping stepped off the plane, he expected to find a struggling colonial outpost, perhaps a little better off than the mainland, but still backward. Instead, he stepped into the future. As his motorcade drove from the airport into the city, the 74-year-old revolutionary pressed his face against the window in disbelief. He saw paved, clean roads lined with manicured trees. He saw public housing estates that provided electricity and running water to every family. He saw a bustling port filled with ships from around the world and a skyline that was beginning to scrape the clouds. It was a slap in the face of communist ideology. Here was a society run by ethnic Chinese with no natural resources that had achieved a standard of living that the average citizen in Beijing could only dream of. The shock was visceral. Deng realized in that car ride that China wasn't just behind, it was falling off the map. The meeting between Kuan and Deng Xiaoping was a collision of two titans, the little dragon meeting the big dragon. Kuan, usually so careful with great powers, decided to drop the diplomatic niceties and speak with a brutal, piercing honesty. He did not bow and he did not apologize for his success. When they sat down, the atmosphere was tense. Deng was a man who had survived the Long March, a hardened warrior of the revolution, while Li was a Cambridge-educated lawyer. But Li knew exactly which button to push to ignite the fire of reform in Deng's mind. He looked at the Chinese leader and delivered one of the most famous and psychologically devastating lines in diplomatic history. He told Deng, "Singapore is a small island with no natural resources. We are the descendants of the landless peasants of South China. You have the scholars, the scientists, and the mandarins. You have the cream of the crop. Anything we can do, you can do better. There is no reason why you cannot overtake us." It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Kuan wasn't just bragging, he was challenging Chinese pride. He was essentially telling Deng, "We are the rejects of your civilization, the poor farmers who fled to coolie labor. You are the elite. If we could build this paradise using Western methods, what is your excuse for the poverty of China?" Deng Xiaoping did not get angry. He sat in silence, absorbing the weight of the challenge. He looked at the spittoons Li had placed in the meeting room, a subtle nod to the old Chinese habits, and realized that Singapore had moved past them. The modernity of Singapore proved that Chinese culture and capitalism were not incompatible. That night at dinner, Deng was quiet, deep in thought. The sight of Singapore had shattered his faith in the Soviet model of economics. He realized that isolation was suicide. When he returned to Beijing, he didn't just talk about reform. He initiated the greatest economic transformation in human history. In his famous "Emancipate the Mind" speech later that year, he explicitly referenced Singapore as a model to be studied and emulated. Kuan had successfully planted a virus of capitalism in the mind of the communist leader. He had turned a potential enemy into a student. By challenging the dragon's ego, He had ensured that when China finally rose, it would look to Singapore not with hostility, but with respect and gratitude, cementing a role for his tiny island as the mentor to the next superpower. The transformation that began in the mind of Deng Xiaoping soon turned into a massive, organized pilgrimage. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, the flight path between Beijing and Singapore became one of the most important intellectual arteries in the world. The Chinese Communist Party did not send a few diplomats to shake hands. They sent thousands upon thousands of mayors, provincial governors, and high-ranking cadres to attend what was essentially a finishing school for authoritarian capitalism. The instruction from the top was clear and absolute. Go to Singapore, look at what they do, and bring it back. This was a profound deviation from the norm, as developing nations usually look to the United States or Western Europe for models of modernization. But the Chinese leadership saw a fatal flaw in the Western model. To become like America, they believed they would have to accept American-style democracy, a free press and the chaotic rotation of power, things that the Communist Party viewed as existential threats to their survival. Singapore offered a tantalizing alternative, a third way. Lee Kuan Yew had proven that you could have a first-world economy, skyscrapers, efficient trains and global corporations, all while maintaining a one-party state with strict media controls and limited civil liberties. For the Chinese communists, this was the holy grail. They looked at Singapore and saw their own dream realized, absolute political control married to absolute economic efficiency. They didn't go to Singapore to learn about freedom. They went to learn about management. They studied how the Housing Development Board managed public housing to prevent ghettos. They studied how the Central Provident Fund accumulated capital. They studied how the Singaporean government managed to be pro-business without being devoured by corruption. Lee Kuan Yew became, in effect, the sensei to the waking giant, the only man who could teach the dragon how to fly without crashing. But for Lee Kuan Yew, this mentorship was not an act of ethnic charity. It was a calculated geopolitical insurance policy. He looked at the future and saw that China was destined to become the dominant military and economic power in Asia. A country of 2 million people cannot fight a country of 1 billion people. If Singapore remained just another neighbor, it would eventually be treated like a vassal state, bullied and pressured. But if Singapore positioned itself as the teacher, the mentor, and the intellectual guide, the dynamic would change. In Asian culture, the teacher commands a specific kind of respect that transcends physical power. By making himself indispensable to China's modernization, Lee Kuan Yew ensured that Beijing had a vested interest in Singapore's survival. You do not destroy the library where you get your knowledge. You do not burn down the house of the man who is showing you the map. This was the manipulation. LKY traded knowledge for security, embedding Singapore into the brain of the Chinese state so deeply that to hurt Singapore would be an act of self-sabotage for China. The culmination of this mentorship was the Suzhou Industrial Park project, launched in the early 1990s. It was the most ambitious attempt to export the Singapore model physically. The idea was to take a piece of land in China and build a clone of Singapore. Not just the factories and roads, but the software. Lee Kuan Yew wanted to transplant the Singaporean legal framework, the transparency, the efficient bureaucracy, and the anti-corruption protocols directly into Chinese soil. It was a massive experiment to see if the Singaporean miracle could be copy-pasted. While the project faced immense challenges, clashing with local Chinese corruption and bureaucratic habits, it stood as a monument to the relationship. It proved that Singapore was not just a trading post, it was a consultant to superpowers. Lee Kuan Yew had successfully positioned his tiny island as the brain trust for the world's next superpower, guaranteeing that as China rose, Singapore would rise with it, riding the dragon's back rather than being trampled by its claws. While Lee Kuan Yew was busy playing the role of the benevolent sensei to the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing, he was simultaneously boarding planes to Washington, D.C. to perform an entirely different, yet equally critical role. To the Chinese, he was the model of Asian success. But to the Americans, he positioned himself as the ultimate China whisperer, the only man in the world who could accurately interpret the confusing, opaque signals coming from behind the bamboo curtain. Lee understood that American presidents, from Ronald Reagan to George H.W. Bush to Bill Clinton, were fundamentally Western creatures. They viewed the world through the lens of liberal democracy, the Cold War, and European history. They did not understand the deep historical scars of the Chinese psyche, the obsession with stability, or the terrifying logic of the Communist Party. They saw China as a monolith to be either feared or democratized, missing the nuance that Kuan saw clearly. He made himself indispensable to the White House by offering a service that the CIA and the State Department could not: cultural translation with the credibility of a statesman. When Kuan sat in the Oval Office, he didn't speak like a supplicant asking for aid. He spoke like a professor giving a private tutorial. He possessed a unique duality that captivated American leaders. He looked Chinese, understood the Confucian operating system, and governed an Asian society. Yet he spoke English with the eloquence of a Cambridge lawyer and possessed a mind that was brutally rational and anti-communist. This allowed him to say things to American presidents that no white advisor could say. He explained to them that China was not going to become a Jeffersonian democracy just because they opened a McDonald's. He explained that for Beijing, human rights was a secondary concern to chaos, and that pushing them too hard on dissident issues would only make them close up like a clam. His greatest act of manipulation during these decades was shaping the American policy of constructive engagement. In the aftermath of the Cold War, there were many hawks in Washington who wanted to treat China like the Soviet Union, to contain it, isolate it, and starve it into submission. Kuan argued ferociously against this. He told presidents and congressmen that an isolated China would be a terrifying China, a giant North Korea with nuclear weapons and 1 billion angry people nursing a grievance against the world. He convinced the American elite that the only way to manage the rise of the dragon was to hug it tight, to integrate China into the World Trade Organization and the global economy. His logic was that if China became rich and trade-dependent, it would have too much to lose to go to war. It would become a stakeholder in the global system rather than a revolutionary force trying to burn it down. But underneath this high-minded advice lay a cold, self-serving geopolitical calculation for Singapore. Kuan did not push for American engagement with China out of love for the Chinese people. He did it to ensure that the United States remained anchored in Asia. He knew that if the US isolated China, the Americans might eventually lose interest in the region and withdraw their fleets to Hawaii, leaving Southeast Asia alone to deal with an angry, dominant Chinese hegemon. By convincing the US to trade with China, he ensured that American aircraft carriers and corporations would stay in the Pacific to protect their investments. He was effectively using the lure of the Chinese market to trap the United States military in Asia as a counterweight. This was the genius of his double game. He used American power to balance Chinese ambition, ensuring that Singapore would never be left alone in a room with a single giant. He wanted a world where the eagle and the dragon were forced to dance together, because as long as they were dancing, neither of them would be stepping on the mouse. The ultimate test of Kuan Yew's geopolitical tightrope walk came on June 4, 1989, when the People's Liberation Army rolled tanks into Tiananmen Square and crushed the student pro-democracy movement. The images of the massacre shocked the world, with the tank man becoming a global symbol of resistance against tyranny, leading the Western world to react with immediate and furious moral outrage. The United States, Europe, and Australia imposed sanctions, isolated Beijing diplomatically, and condemned the Chinese Communist Party as butchers who had lost their legitimacy. The global expectation was that Singapore, a close ally of the United States and a bastion of English common law, would join the chorus of condemnation, but Kuan Yew did the exact opposite. While the rest of the world was screaming about human rights, Kuan Yew looked at the carnage and saw a brutal but necessary calculation for survival. He refused to condemn Deng Xiaoping. Instead, he offered a cold, realist defense of the crackdown that horrified Western liberals, but resonated deeply with the terrified leaders in Beijing. He argued to the world that China was simply too vast, too complex, and too historically fragile to be governed by Western-style democracy, famously stating that if you tried to impose a British parliamentary system on a country of 1 billion peasants, the result wouldn't be freedom. It would be chaos, warlordism, and civil war. He framed the massacre not as an act of evil, but as an act of desperate statecraft, arguing that shooting a few thousand students to prevent a nation of 1 billion from fracturing was a tragedy, yes, but a necessary one in the harsh arithmetic of Asian governance. This stance was a masterstroke of the double game. serving two distinct strategic purposes that had nothing to do with the students in the square and everything to do with the interests of Singapore. First, it earned him eternal credit with the Chinese Communist Party. In their darkest hour, when they were pariahs on the global stage and their economy was on the brink of collapse due to sanctions, Lee Kuan Yew stood by them. He told the West to stop moralizing and to keep trading, arguing that isolating China would only make it dangerous. Beijing never forgot this loyalty, cementing Lee's status not just as a friend, but as an old friend, the highest honor in Chinese diplomacy, ensuring that Singapore would always have special access to the Chinese leadership. But the second purpose was even more Machiavellian. Lee Kuan Yew used the defense of China as a shield to defend his own authoritarian rule in Singapore against American pressure. During the 1990s, the United States, flush with victory from the Cold War, began aggressively exporting the idea of democracy and human rights, criticizing Singapore's strict laws, its censorship, and its use of the death penalty. By defending China's right to maintain order, Lee was actually articulating the Asian values thesis, arguing that Asians cared more about social stability, family, and economic growth than they did about individual civil liberties. He used the Chinese example to tell the Americans, "Back off. Your values are not universal. What works in New York does not work in Beijing, and it does not work in Singapore." By positioning himself as the philosopher king of Asian authoritarianism, he created an ideological buffer zone. He could dismiss American criticisms of Singapore's human rights record as Western cultural imperialism, using the massive shadow of China to hide his own island's strictness. He effectively told the Clinton administration that if they pushed too hard on democracy in Asia, they wouldn't just lose Singapore, they would lose the entire continent to chaos. It was a brilliant maneuver that allowed him to keep his draconian internal laws while still taking American money, proving once again that in his world, morality was always secondary to survival. By 1993, Lee Kuan Yew had achieved economic prosperity and internal stability, but he sought a different kind of power, one that money couldn't buy and armies couldn't enforce. He wanted diplomatic indispensability, the most volatile flashpoint in Asia, the place most likely to trigger World War III, was the Taiwan Strait. The communist government in Beijing and the nationalist government in Taipei had been in a state of frozen civil war since 1949, refusing to recognize each other's legitimacy, viewing each other as mortal enemies, and maintaining a silence so deep that one miscalculation could lead to nuclear catastrophe. They desperately needed to talk, to establish protocols to prevent accidental war, but they faced an impossible protocol problem. The Chinese officials could not go to Taipei without looking like they were recognizing a rebel government, and the Taiwanese officials could not go to Beijing without looking like they were surrendering to the communists. They needed a neutral ground, a place that was culturally Chinese enough to feel comfortable, yet politically sovereign enough to be safe. They needed a third party who held the absolute trust of both sides, and in the entire world, there was only one man who fit that description. Lee Kuan Yew had spent decades cultivating a bizarre and contradictory relationship with both capitals. On one hand, he was the old friend of Beijing, the mentor to their economic reforms and the defender of their crackdown at Tiananmen. On the other hand, he had a deep secret history with Taiwan. For years, Singaporean troops had trained in the hills of Taiwan under Operation Starlight, and Lee was close personal friends with the Taiwanese leadership. He was the only statesman who could walk into the presidential palace in Taipei and the Great Hall of the People in Beijing and be greeted with equal warmth. Thus, in April 1993, the impossible happened in Singapore. The Wangkou talks took place, the first high-level contact between the two sides since 1949. The images of Wang Daohan and Ku Chen-fu shaking hands across a table in Singapore were beamed around the world, signaling that the ice of the Cold War in Asia was finally cracking. But for Lee Kuan Yew, hosting the summit was not an act of altruism, it was a masterstroke of the double game. By facilitating this meeting, he effectively transformed Singapore into the Switzerland of the East, a neutral zone where enemies could meet without fighting. This role elevated Singapore from a mere trading hub to a vital diplomatic cog in the machinery of global peace. It made the island untouchable. You do not invade the country that holds the keys to the back channel. You do not bomb the conference room where the peace treaties are signed. Li positioned himself as the grand conduit of information, the man who carried the messages that were too sensitive to be written down. This utility extended to the United States as well. Washington often found itself in a diplomatic bind, needing to send stern warnings or subtle offers to Beijing without triggering a public incident or humiliating the Chinese leadership, which would demand a face-saving response. They used Kuan. American presidents and secretaries of state would brief Li before his trips to China, knowing he would convey their sentiments accurately and privately to the Chinese leadership, stripping away the diplomatic noise to deliver the hard truths. Conversely, when China wanted to signal its red lines on Taiwan to the Americans without issuing a formal threat, they whispered in Li's ear. He became the geopolitical translator, the buffer between the eagle and the dragon. This ensured that no matter how tense the relationship between the superpowers became, neither could afford to lose Singapore. The tiny island was no longer just a dot on the map. It was the dedicated fiber optic cable connecting the world's greatest powers, securing its sovereignty not just through missiles and tanks, but through the unparalleled power of holding the world's secrets. In the twilight of his life, throughout the 2000s and leading up to his death in 2015, Kuan transformed from a national builder into a global prophet. He was no longer concerned with the day-to-day management of Singapore, having handed the reins to the younger generation. Instead, his mind was entirely focused on the gathering storm on the horizon. He saw what few others in the West were willing to admit. The era of uncontested American hegemony was ending, and the era of Chinese dominance was beginning. While the United States was bogged down in the deserts of Iraq and Afghanistan, spending trillions of dollars fighting insurgencies, Kuan watched with growing alarm as Beijing quietly poured concrete, built aircraft carriers, and expanded its influence across the South China Sea. He realized that the delicate balance he had spent 50 years constructing was unraveling. If the United States remained distracted and China continued to rise unchecked, Southeast Asia would inevitably slide back into a tributary system where Beijing dictated the rules and small nations like Singapore obeyed. So the Grand Master embarked on one final diplomatic mission, perhaps the most urgent of his career. He flew to Washington, D.C. in 2009 to meet with the newly elected President Barack Obama. Kuan did not go there to exchange pleasantries. He went there to deliver a warning. In the Oval Office, the 86-year-old statesman looked at the young American president and told him bluntly that the United States was losing the plot. He argued that if America did not reassert its presence in Asia immediately, it would be relegated to the status of a secondary power within a generation. He famously told the American establishment, "China is sucking the Southeast Asian countries into its economic system because of its vast market and growing purchasing power. Japan and South Korea will inevitably be sucked in. It just absorbs them." He warned that without a strong U.S. security umbrella, there would be no balance, only Chinese hegemony. It was Kuan who provided the intellectual architecture for what became known as the pivot to Asia. He told the Americans, "You must remain. You must keep your 7th Fleet in the Pacific. You must trade with us via the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. If you leave, you don't just lose influence, you lose the future." He was essentially begging the eagle not to fly away, not because he loved America, but because he knew that Singapore needed the American military to check the Chinese military. He needed the heavyweight champion of the world to stay in the ring, because if the ring emptied out, the dragon would have no reason to be polite to the mouse. But Kuan was playing a double game until his very last breath. While he was urging the Americans to arm themselves and stay put, he was simultaneously whispering in the ears of the new leadership in Beijing. He had watched the transition of power from the cautious pragmatism of Deng Xiaoping to the more assertive nationalism of the rising generation led by Xi Jinping. Li saw the danger of hubris. He saw that China, drunk on 30 years of explosive economic growth, was beginning to abandon Deng's maxim of "hide your strength, bide your time." They were beginning to flex their muscles, claiming islands, building bases, and using wolf warrior diplomacy. Kuan's message to Xi Jinping and the Politburo was a stark warning against arrogance. He told them that the concept of a peaceful rise was a beautiful slogan, but the world was watching their actions, not their words. He warned them, "If you try to dominate Asia too quickly, if you scare your neighbors, you will trigger a coalition against you. India, Japan, Vietnam, Australia, and the United States will unite to contain you. You will surround yourself with enemies. He was trying to save China from its own ambition, arguing that true power comes from patience and economic integration, not from bullying smaller neighbors over fishing rights. He told them that for China to truly lead, it had to be accepted, not just feared. This was the final masterclass of the old fox. To the Americans, he preached the danger of Chinese strength to keep them engaged. To the Chinese, he preached the danger of American containment to keep them cautious. He played the two fears against each other perfectly. His goal was to create a permanent state of tension, a Goldilocks geopolitical zone, where the US was strong enough to deter China, and China was strong enough to enrich the region, but neither was strong enough to rule alone. He knew that for a small state like Singapore, a world with two bosses is a headache, but a world with one boss is a prison. By ensuring that the giants remained locked in a stare-down, he carved out the breathing room for Singapore to remain sovereign. Even from his sickbed, as his health failed, he remained the only man who could tell the emperor he had no clothes and tell the president he was losing his empire, ensuring that the balance of power held for just a little while longer. To understand the grand strategy that Lee Kuan Yew bequeathed to Singapore, one must move beyond the chessboard and look to the forest. In Asian philosophy, there is a profound respect for the bamboo. The oak tree is mighty and rigid. It stands tall and refuses to bow, but when the typhoon comes, the oak tree snaps and falls. The bamboo, however, is hollow and flexible. It bends with the wind, it sways in the storm, and when the gale passes, it snaps back, upright and unbroken. This is the bamboo philosophy, known in the halls of international relations as the strategy of hedging. It is the refusal to be rigid in a world of hurricane-forced geopolitical winds. Lee Kuan Yew realized that for a small state to survive the collision of superpowers, it could not afford the luxury of absolute loyalty. It had to bet on every horse in the race, ensuring that no matter who won, Singapore would cash a ticket. This strategy created a national existence, defined by a stark, calculated schizophrenia. Lee Kuan Yew designed a system where Singapore's heart and its wallet live in two different hemispheres. Economically, Singapore is inextricably tied to China. Beijing is its largest trading partner, the destination for its investments, and the source of the tourists who fill its hotels. If the Chinese economy sneezes, Singapore catches pneumonia. Therefore, Singapore champions free trade, welcomes the Belt and Road Initiative, and constantly calls for the world to respect China's rise. To an observer looking only at the ledger, Singapore appears to be a close ally of Beijing, but peel back the layer of commerce and you find the layer of steel. Security-wise, Singapore is essentially an American outpost. It flies American F-15s, its pilots train in Idaho and Arizona, and its military doctrine is NATO-compatible. Most tellingly, after the United States lost its massive naval base at Subic Bay in the Philippines in the 1990s, it was Lee Kuan Yew who quietly offered the U.S. Navy a new home. He built a deep-water pier at Changi Naval Base, specifically designed to accommodate a Nimitz-class nuclear aircraft carrier. He wanted the physical presence of American military might parked in his backyard. To an observer looking only at the military, Singapore appears to be a staunch ally of Washington. This is the genius of the hedge, giving Beijing the trade deals while giving Washington the aircraft carrier berth. It is a deliberate state of contradiction. Lee Kuan Yew understood that total alignment with either side was a death sentence. If Singapore went 100% with China, it would lose the security guarantee of the US and become a vassal state, bullied by a hegemon with a long memory. If Singapore went 100% with the US, it would be economically strangled by China and treated as a hostile enemy on its own doorstep. The only path to survival was the middle way. But this strategy relies on a very specific, cynical condition. Singapore needs the giants to fight, but not to war. Lee Kuan Yew realized that tension is profitable. As long as the US and China are competing for influence in Southeast Asia, they are both bidding for Singapore's favor. The US sends high-tech weapons to woo them. China sends infrastructure projects and trade deals to woo them. Singapore sits in the middle, taking the weapons from one hand and the money from the other, thanking both. This is the Goldilocks zone of geopolitics. Total peace is bad, because if the US and China became best friends, they wouldn't need a middleman. Total war is bad, because Singapore would be the battlefield. The ideal state is a cold peace, a perpetual rivalry where both sides are insecure enough to need friends, but rational enough not to shoot. Kuan constructed a nation that feeds on this anxiety, a bamboo stalk that roots itself in the soil of tension, growing tall not in spite of the storm but because of it. The era of the Grand Master is over. Kuan passed away in 2015, leaving the stage just as the curtains were rising on the most dangerous act of the play. He built a masterpiece of diplomatic engineering, a machine designed to run on the tension between the United States and China. But today, that machine is under stress like never before. The world he warned us about has arrived. The rivalry between Washington and Beijing has shifted from a polite competition into a cold war of tariffs, technology bans, and military posturing. The Goldilocks zone is shrinking. In both capitals, the hardliners are taking over, demanding absolute loyalty and punishing neutrality. They are forcing countries to choose, squeezing the middle ground where Singapore has lived and thrived for 50 years. The current leaders of Singapore are finding that the tightrope Kuan walked is now thinner, higher, and being buffeted by hurricane-force winds. But the legacy of Kuan is not a set of rigid instructions. It is a way of thinking. It is a lesson that echoes far beyond the shores of Southeast Asia, a lesson for every small nation, every startup and every individual trying to survive among giants. The lesson is that you do not choose the side of the strong, you choose the side of yourself. You do not survive by being submissive, you survive by being useful. Kuan proved that size is not destiny. He proved that a small state, if it is smart enough, disciplined enough, and valuable enough, can invert the hierarchy of power. He showed that you can take American money without becoming American, and you can take Chinese culture without becoming Chinese. You can be your own man, even when the world tells you that you must be a servant. Ultimately, his genius comes down to a fundamental rewriting of the laws of nature. There is an ancient proverb that warns small nations of their place in the world. When elephants fight, the grass suffers. It means that when superpowers collide, the small get trampled. But Kuan added a darker, more cynical corollary to that wisdom. He realized that when elephants make love, the grass also suffers. If the great powers are too friendly, they will divide the world up between them, and the small will be crushed by their embrace. The secret of Kuan was that he refused to accept the fate of the grass. Through sheer will, intellect, and Machiavellian strategy, he transformed his nation from a soft patch of green that could be trampled by anyone into a bed of steel spikes. He made sure that any elephant that tried to step on Singapore, whether to fight or to hug, would regret it. This is the art of the balancer. This is the survival of the smartest. To understand how the game is played before the next crisis begins, make sure you are subscribed to the LKY files. The archives are closed,